The moment the sky cracked open above Ridgeline Creek, and the canyon walls began to weep brown water, Rose Hale understood with absolute certainty that she was going to die alone in the wilderness of Colorado Territory. And that understanding lasted exactly 43 seconds before a mountain of a man with shoulders like barn doors stepped out of the pines and changed everything about the rest of her life. It was the spring of 1874, and the high country above Durango had been holding its breath all winter. Rose had arrived in the territory 6 weeks earlier on a mail coach from Kansas, carrying a carpet bag, a small wooden chest of her mother's things, and a letter of employment from a woman named Clara Dobbins, who ran the only schoolhouse in the mining settlement of Elk Hollow. The settlement sat in a narrow valley below the San Juan Mountains, accessible by a single wagon road that cut through a gorge carved by Ridgeline Creek. It was pretty country, the kind of pretty that could kill you if you forgot to respect it, and Rose Hale, 23 years old and raised in flat country, had not yet learned that particular lesson. She had ridden out from Elk Hollow on a borrowed bay mare that morning against the advice of Clara Dobbins, who had looked at the sky with narrow eyes and said that the mountains were breathing wrong. Rose had not known what breathing wrong meant. She knew about prairie storms, about the long, flat anger of a Kansas sky turning green before a tornado, but she did not know about the way high-country snowmelt could funnel into a canyon with the speed and fury of something alive, something with intention. She had told Clara she was only going to the trading post at Miller's Crossing, 5 miles up the gorge road, to pick up her teaching supplies that had arrived by freight wagon. She had said she would be back before noon. She was not back before noon. The mare had thrown a shoe 2 miles into the gorge, and Rose had been walking her back carefully, picking her way along the rocky road when she heard the sound. It was not what she expected a flood to sound like. She had expected a roar, something dramatic and obvious. What she heard first was a low, grinding moan, like the earth itself clearing its throat. Then she heard the trees. They were snapping somewhere up the canyon, popping like gunshots in sequence, one after another, and when she turned to look she saw the wall of water coming around the bend. It was not entirely water. It was water and mud and broken timber and red clay, and the wreckage of everything that had been standing in the canyon above her, and it was moving faster than a horse at full gallop, filling the gorge from wall to wall, and Rose Hale did the only sensible thing she could think of, which was to release the mare's reins and scramble up the canyon wall. The wall was not steep enough. That was the brutal mathematics of the situation. The canyon walls were sheer where she needed them to be sheer and merely steep where she was standing, and the ledge she grabbed held her maybe 8 feet above the road, which was not 8 feet above what was coming. The mare had bolted upstream, which seemed wrong to Rose, but horses knew things she did not, and she had no time to think about it because the water was already foaming at her boots. She screamed. She was not ashamed of that. She screamed with everything she had into the roaring brown chaos below her, and she dug her fingers into a crack in the sandstone and hung on, and she was absolutely certain that the ledge was going to crumble and she was going to go down into that churning mass of destruction. And then she heard a voice above the noise. Not the voice of God, though afterward she sometimes thought it might as well have been. "Hold on. Do not let go. I am coming down to you." She craned her neck upward and saw him on a shelf of rock about 20 feet above her, moving along it with a surety that made no sense given the conditions. He was enormous. That was the first thing she registered, the sheer physical scale of him, a man so broad through the chest and shoulders that he seemed to fill a section of sky. He wore a heavy canvas coat that was already soaked through, and his hair, dark brown and past his collar, was plastered against his neck and jaw, and he was moving toward her with a length of rope coiled over one arm, and his expression was utterly calm in a way that struck her even then as the most remarkable thing she had ever seen. He reached a point above her and braced himself against a jutting outcrop that looked like it had been placed there by someone who planned for exactly this moment, and he shook out the rope and dropped one end. "Tie that around your waist," he shouted. "Double it through itself. Do you know a reef knot?" "I do not," she screamed back. "Then make a loop and pull it tight and hold the end with both hands. I have got you. Do not look at the water." She tied the rope the best she could, which was not beautifully but was securely, and she looked up at him and nodded, and he said, "Hold the wall with your feet and walk backward. I will take the weight." He was not lying about taking the weight. She felt the rope go taut, and she felt, with a shock that went all the way through her, that it was like being held by a machine. He did not strain or stumble. He simply planted himself and took her weight as though she were a child and began to haul her upward hand over hand. And she walked her boots up the sandstone wall and tried not to think about the 30 feet of churning brown catastrophe below her. And within 2 minutes that felt like 2 years, she was on the shelf beside him. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand. He caught her by both arms, and his hands were enormous, and he steadied her with the same matter-of-fact competence he had used on everything else. "You are safe," he said. "Stand here, do not move closer to the edge." He pulled her back from the edge himself, keeping his hands on her arms until she was against the canyon wall, and then he looked down at the flood with those calm eyes and said nothing for a long moment. "Was that your horse?" he asked. "I had a mare. She ran. Upstream, smart animal. There is a wide spot above where the canyon opens. She will have made for higher ground. We can look for her once this passes." Rose looked at him properly for the first time. He was perhaps 29 or 30, with a strong jaw that carried several days of dark beard and eyes that were a peculiar shade of hazel, almost amber in the flat gray light of the storm. His face was the face of a man who spent most of his time outdoors, weathered but not ravaged, and there was a kind of steadiness in his features that she would spend the next several months trying to find words for and eventually stop trying, because some things simply existed without adequate description. He was, she thought with the strange clarity that sometimes comes in the aftermath of terror, the most physically capable person she had ever seen in her life. His forearms, where his coat was pushed up, were corded with muscle over thick bone. His neck was thick and strong. Even standing still, he conveyed an impression of leashed, patient power. "Thank you," she said, which seemed inadequate but was what she had. "You are welcome," he said simply. "I am Jasper Thatcher. I have a camp about half a mile above. Once the water drops enough to move, I will take you there. What is your name?" "Rose Hale. I am the new schoolteacher in Elk Hollow." He looked at her then with something that might have been surprise, though on his face it was very subtle. "You came up the gorge road today. I was told it was safe. In April." He said it without judgment, only a particular flatness that was worse than judgment. "In April in the San Juans after a wet winter." "I did not know," she said. "I am from Kansas." He looked at her for another moment and then looked away at the water. "Now you know," he said. She almost laughed. The shaking was beginning to ease, and something about his blunt simplicity, his total absence of melodrama, reached through the fear and found something steady in her. "Now I know," she agreed. They waited on the ledge for 2 hours. He had provisions in a pack he wore on his back, and he produced hardtack and dried venison, and a canteen of clean water with no ceremony, and offered them to her first, and she ate gratefully and watched the flood below them gradually lose its ferocity. He ate sparingly and said little, but what he said was always useful, always practical. He pointed out the high water marks on the canyon walls and told her that the flood would drop another 4 feet before it was safe to move. He told her that the canyon had flooded like this every 5 to 10 years, that the old-timers in the valley knew to watch the snowpack on a particular ridge above Miller's Crossing, and that the snowpack this year had been twice the normal depth. "Do you live here?" Rose asked. "In the mountains, I mean. Up on the south slope of the ridge," he said. "I have a cabin there. I come down to the settlements maybe 4 or 5 times a year for supplies and to sell furs." "You trap and hunt." "I came down today to sell winter pelts to the trading post at Miller's Crossing." He paused. Lucky timing. That settled something in her chest like a warm stone. When the water dropped enough, he climbed down first and tested the footing on the gorge road, which was now a slick channel of brown mud strewn with debris. Then he looked up at her and opened his arms. "I will carry you down," he said. "The footing is not reliable and you are in skirts." "I can manage," she said. "Miss Hale." He said it without impatience. "I have walked this gorge in every condition it has to offer. You have been on it once in good weather and you had a horse. Let me carry you." She looked at him and he looked at her, and there was nothing in his expression that made her feel small or helpless. There was only that steadiness, that absolute, unhurried competence. She climbed down to the lowest safe point and he stepped in and lifted her, and she gasped a little at the ease of it, the complete lack of effort. He carried her like she weighed nothing remarkable, one arm beneath her knees and one across her back, and he walked through the flood residue with his boots sinking into the mud with each step and his breathing utterly even. Rose Hale, who had never in her 23 years been carried by anyone, kept her hands folded in her lap and stared at the canyon wall and felt something happening in the center of her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. It was not embarrassment, though there was a little of that. It was not fear, which had largely subsided. It was something that felt almost like recognition, which made no sense at all because she had never met this man before today. He carried her for nearly half a mile through the worst of the mud and debris before the road firmed up enough that she could walk, and he set her down with the same effortless care with which he had lifted her. She straightened her coat and looked up at him and said, for the second time, "Thank you." "You do not have to keep thanking me," he said. "I will stop when I feel I have said it enough times," she said. He almost smiled. It was very close to a smile. She stored it away. His camp was where he had said it was, a lean-to structure built against a granite overhang with a cold fire pit and his horse and a mule picketed on a long line in the trees. The camp was orderly and efficient, everything in its place, ropes coiled properly, tools stowed. He built a fire with a speed and competence that was becoming a pattern, and he produced a blanket from his pack and put it around her shoulders, and told her that her mare had likely made it to the wide spot above, because the flooding did not extend to the upper canyon this time of year. "How do you know so much about this specific place?" she asked, sitting close enough to the fire to feel the warmth reaching her hands. "I have lived in these mountains for 8 years, he said. "You learn them or you do not survive them. That is the simplest version." "What were you before?" she asked, then caught herself. "I am sorry, that is not my business." "I was in the army," he said. He was crouching by the fire, feeding it with precise additions of wood. "Before that I was from Ohio. I came west after the war and I did not feel like going back." She understood that there was a great deal packed into those words that he was not elaborating on, and she respected it the way she would have respected a locked door. "I came west because the east felt too small," she said. "My mother passed last year, my father before her. I had an offer of work here and I took it because I wanted something new. I wanted to be somewhere that was still becoming itself." He looked at her then, and the amber hazel of his eyes in the firelight was remarkable. "That is a good way to put it," he said. They waited at his camp while the storm finished its business overhead and the afternoon wore toward evening. He tracked down her mare just as he had predicted in the wide meadow above the canyon constriction, and he brought the animal back with a gentleness toward the horse that Rose noticed and catalogued. He was good with animals. They trusted him. The mare, who had been skittish with Rose all morning, let him approach on his first try and stood quiet while he checked her remaining shoes. "She is fine," he said. "The shoe she lost was on her left fore. I have got a shoe and the tools to fit it. I can do it tonight and we can get you back to Elk Hollow in the morning." "You do not have to go to the trouble," Rose said. "The gorge road will still be bad tomorrow. You do not know it and you do not know this country well enough to take the high trail alone. I will take you to the valley road, and then you can follow it down to the settlement." He said this as simply as he said everything else, as though it were a logical equation that had already solved itself. "You are not what I expected when I thought of a mountain man," Rose said. He raised his eyebrows slightly, which she was learning was his version of significant expression. "What did you expect? Someone more." She searched for words. "Wild, unkempt, unpredictable." He looked down at himself and then back at her with that almost smile again. "I have been called a great many things. Unpredictable is not usually one of them." She laughed then, a real laugh, and it surprised her the way a laugh sometimes surprised you after fear, the fullness of it, the release. He watched her laugh and something crossed his face that was quicker than thought, something warm and private, and then it was gone and he was tending the fire again. He shod the mare by firelight with a precision that was extraordinary to watch. His hands, so large that they seemed like they would be clumsy, were not clumsy at all. They were deliberate and sure, and the mare stood steady for him the entire time, and Rose sat on a log and watched and told herself she was watching because she had nothing else to do. They camped separately and properly, as was right for people who had known each other for half a day, but they talked across the fire until well past dark, which Rose would later remember as the first long conversation she had in Colorado territory where she did not feel like she was performing the role of schoolteacher or new arrival. She felt, talking to Jasper Thatcher, like someone who had simply met another person and found the conversation worth continuing. He told her about the mountains in winter, about how the silence in high country snow was a different thing from other silences, about the elk that came through his meadow in December, about a bear that had investigated his cabin's door 3 years ago and left a set of claw marks he had never seen any reason to patch. She told him about Kansas, about her mother's garden, about the particular quality of prairie light in summer when the wheat was high and gold, and the horizon looked like something a painter had invented rather than something real. He listened the way very few people listened, with full attention, not waiting for his turn to speak. When the fire burned low and the cold came down hard from the peaks above, she pulled his blanket closer around herself and he banked the coals and told her to sleep and that he would keep watch, which she began to protest, and he said, "Miss Hale, you were nearly killed today. Sleep." She slept. In the morning the gorge road was passable but treacherous, and he led her through it with his horse setting the pace and himself walking, leading both animals by hand through the worst sections. He would not ride when she had to pick her way carefully because he said the horse's weight would destabilize the road surface, and he could feel the footing better on foot. This seemed logical to her. She was beginning to understand that everything he did had a logical structure underpinning it, and that his practical intelligence was as much a part of him as his remarkable physical capability. He left her at the top of the valley road, where the gorge opened out into a wide meadow, and the wheel ruts of the wagon road were visible heading south toward Elk Hollow. He stood holding his horse's reins and looking at her with that calm, measuring expression. "You will be all right from here," he said. "Keep the mare at a walk. The road is soft but clear. Will you come through Elk Hollow?" she asked. "When you come down to the settlements?" "Sometimes," he said. "The general store there is cheaper than Miller's Crossing for dry goods." "Then I hope I see you again," she said, and she said it plainly, the way he said things without artifice, and she watched his face carefully when she said it. The something that crossed his face this time was slower and warmer and did not disappear as quickly. "I expect you will," he said. She rode south and did not look back, which took considerable effort. Clara Dobbins met her at the door of the schoolhouse with the controlled expression of a woman who had been genuinely frightened and was expressing it as irritation, and she listened to Rose's account of the flood and Jasper Thatcher with an expression that shifted gradually from relief to something knowing and amused. "Jasper Thatcher," Clara repeated when Rose finished. "You were pulled out of the flood by Jasper Thatcher." "He carried me through the worst of it, yes," Rose said. "Do you know him?" "Everyone in this valley knows of Jasper Thatcher," Clara said. "He has been in these mountains for years. He is a good man, keeps to himself, sells his furs fair. Helped Frank Holly's dig out after a rock slide 3 winters back." She paused. "He is not a man given to socializing." "He talked to me all evening," Rose said, and immediately wished she had said it differently because Clara's eyebrows rose all the way up and her knowing look became positively encyclopedic. "Did he?" Clara said, in a tone that was not a question. Rose unpacked her things and set up her quarters in the small room behind the schoolroom, and told herself that she was not going to spend the next weeks waiting to see a mountain man at the general store, because that was a ridiculous way for a grown woman to spend her time. She spent the next weeks doing exactly that. Not in any obvious way. She taught her students, 19 children between the ages of 6 and 14, whose various levels of education were a genuine pedagogical challenge, and she liked the work with a fierceness that surprised her. She organized the schoolroom properly and sourced books and argued pleasantly with the school board, which was 3 miners and a rancher, about the importance of geography and literature alongside arithmetic. She made herself useful in the community. She learned the names of her neighbors and the layout of the town and the social architecture of Elk Hollow, which was a mining settlement, but also a ranching community and a trading point, and contained within it the entire complexity of any human community anywhere. But when she walked to the general store for supplies, which she did more often than was strictly necessary, she noticed who came and went through Elk Hollow, and she told herself it was simple community awareness, and not that she was watching for a specific tall man with dark hair past his collar and amber hazel eyes. He came in the 3rd week of May. She was at the general store counter when he came through the door, and she knew him immediately even though he had changed his coat, and his jaw was now clean-shaved, which altered his appearance more than she would have expected. He was still unmistakably himself. You could not mistake that size, those shoulders, that quality of stillness. He saw her and stopped, and his face did the thing she had thought about, the thing where something warm moved through his expression with a particular care, as though the warmth were valuable and he did not want to waste it carelessly. "Miss Hale," he said. "Mr. Thatcher," she said, "you are clean-shaved." "I come to town looking like a respectable person occasionally," he said. "How is your mare?" "She is fine. She has forgiven me for the gorge road, though I think she thinks less of my judgment than she used to." "Horses are good judges of character," he said. "Is that a comment on my character?" she asked. "Your character is fine," he said. "Your judgment about weather and mountain geography needed improvement. That is not the same thing." She laughed, and he bought his dry goods with few words and many exact coins, because he was that kind of man, and when he came to leave she said, without planning to say it, "Would you like supper before you ride back? The boarding house does a reasonable pot roast on Fridays." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without flinching because she was not a woman who flinched from things she meant. "Yes," he said, "I would." The pot roast was, in fact, excellent, and they sat across from each other at a corner table in Mrs. Patterson's boarding house dining room, and the conversation picked up exactly where it had left off by the campfire, with the ease of 2 people who had established a frequency and found it still working. He told her about his winter, about a particular storm in January that had lasted 4 days, and the drifts it had left on his south meadow, about the cougar that had taken one of his chickens and the conversation he'd had with it from his porch, speaking firmly into the darkness about the social contract between predators and farmers. Rose laughed until she pressed her napkin to her eyes. "You talked to the cougar. It seemed to work," he said. "She took a rabbit from my snare the following week and left the chickens alone." He paused, "though I recognize that may not have been a direct result of the conversation." "You are funnier than I expected," she said. "You keep saying what I am not what you expected," he said. "What did you read about mountain men before you came west?" "Dime novels," she admitted. "Ah," he considered this. "How did those go?" "The mountain men in them shot a great deal of things and said very little and seemed primarily interested in frontier justice rather than supper conversation." "Those are not entirely inaccurate as a category," he said. "I simply am not a representative sample." She looked at him across the table in the warm light of Mrs. Patterson's dining room and thought that she would like to have supper with this man every Friday for the foreseeable future, and possibly beyond that. He came back. That was the thing that mattered. 2 weeks later he was in Elk Hollow again, which was more frequently than he had said he came down, and he traded his furs at Holly's general store, and he appeared at her classroom door on a Saturday afternoon when she was sorting books, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and asked if she wanted to walk out to the creek meadow because the wildflowers were coming in and it was worth seeing. She said yes. She said it before he had finished the sentence. The meadow was everything he had implied. The creek ran clean and fast with snowmelt, and the meadow around it was thick with columbine, blue and white and pale purple, and the mountains above were still snow-capped, and the sky was that particular blue that Colorado did better than anywhere else Rose had ever been, a blue that went straight through the eye and kept going. They walked along the creek bank and she asked him about flowers, because she did not know mountain wildflowers, and he knew every one of them. He knew them by common name, and he knew what the indigenous peoples of the region had used them for, because he had spent years learning from Ute people he had encountered in the high country, trading and talking and listening. He said this with a directness and a respect that she noticed. "The Ute were here long before any of us," he said, matter-of-factly. It seemed important to understand what they knew about this place. "A lot of people out here do not see it that way," Rose said carefully. "A lot of people out here are wrong," he said, with the same flatness he had used about the Gorge Road in April. It was not a political speech. It was simply a statement of what he considered a fact, and she found the directness of it bracing. They sat on a flat rock above the creek and the afternoon settled around them in warmth and birdsong, and at some point the distance between them on the rock was no longer quite as much distance as it had been, not dramatically, not awkwardly, but the way a stream gradually narrows without you noticing, until it is suddenly close enough to step across. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask," he said. "I may not answer. Have you ever wanted to come back down from the mountain, to live among people?" He was quiet for a while, which she had learned was his way of considering something properly before speaking. "I like solitude," he said finally, "but I find I have been coming down to Elk Hollow more often recently." He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the creek. She looked at the creek too. "I find I have been hoping you would," she said. He turned then and looked at her directly, and the amber hazel of his eyes in the afternoon light was doing the thing she liked, that warm thing. "Rose," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the deliberateness of it was as clear as a signature. "Jasper," she said. He reached out and took her hand, which was lying on the rock between them, and he held it the way he did everything, with a sure and careful steadiness, and they sat like that for a long time above the columbine meadow while the creek ran its cold, bright course below them, and the mountains stood patient and white against the blue sky. He started coming down every 2 weeks, then every week through June and into July. He had his trade reasons and his supply reasons, and he used them, but they both knew what the real reason was. He would appear at the schoolhouse door on a Saturday, and she would appear at the general store on a Tuesday, and they would find each other with the inevitability of streams finding rivers. He took her up into the high country twice that summer, with Clara Dobbins as chaperone on both occasions, because they were in a small community and Rose had her reputation and her position to consider, and Jasper, who had spent 8 years outside social structures, understood them with the precision of someone who had chosen to step outside them voluntarily and could therefore see them clearly. Clara Dobbins was an excellent chaperone in that she rode ahead on a sufficient distance to be present without being intrusive, and she had, Rose suspected, an appreciation for romance that she expressed through strategic near-deafness. On the first high-country trip, Jasper took them to a lake so clear and still it perfectly reflected the peaks above it, and he knew the path up to it by heart in the dark. He pointed out the line where the tree line ended, and the alpine tundra began and explained the ecology of it with a knowledge that was both deep and casual. He knew this mountain the way Rose knew the layout of a well-organized book, intimately and without effort, every passage familiar. On the way back down, he lifted her over a difficult section of trail with his hands at her waist, and when he set her down, he did not immediately remove his hands and she did not step away from them, and they stood like that for a moment with the weight of the altitude around them. And then Clara's horse sneezed loudly somewhere in the trees below, and they both laughed, and the moment released itself into the afternoon. On the second trip, they were above the tree line when a summer storm blew in fast from the west, the kind of high-country storm that does not announce itself properly and arrives with theatrical abruptness. The sky went from blue to dark gray in 15 minutes, and the first lightning struck a ridge to the north, and Clara Dobbins, to her enormous credit, immediately began talking about getting the horses down. Jasper moved with his usual efficient calm, getting them below the tree line before the rain hit properly, and when the full weight of the storm arrived, he found them shelter under a massive granite overhang, and built a fire there with wet wood and dry tinder from his pack, which Rose had never seen done by anyone who did not have Jasper Thatcher's particular relationship with fire. Clara sat by the fire working on needlepoint she had brought from her bag with the serene practicality of a woman who had been surprised by weather many times and had developed philosophical acceptance of it. Jasper sat on the other side of Rose from Clara, and the three of them watched the rain come down the mountain in silver curtains, and Rose leaned slightly into Jasper's shoulder without entirely meaning to, and his arm came around her in a way that was perfectly natural, as though it had always been there, and had simply been waiting to come home. Clara Dobbins looked at her needlepoint with great concentration and said nothing. The storm passed. They rode back to Elk Hollow in the clean-washed late afternoon with the smell of rain on pine all around them, and at the edge of town where Clara very practically decided to check on something at the general store, Jasper and Rose had a moment alone on horseback in the golden hour light. "I want to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those steady amber eyes, and she could see him organizing it, the way he organized everything, finding the right structure. "I came down from that mountain because of you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. The trade and the supplies were always fine before. You are the reason I come down now." "I know," she said, "and I would like to keep coming down," he said, "with a view to something more formal than supper and walks if you are of a like mind." "Jasper Thatcher," she said, and her voice was warm with something that was almost laughter but was larger than laughter. "Are you courting me?" "I am attempting to," he said. "I am not experienced at it. I apologize if the method has been unclear." "The method has been perfectly clear," she said. "The answer is yes." His face did what it did so rarely and so completely that it was always startling. It broke open into a full smile, real and wide and illuminating, and it transformed him so dramatically that Rose thought she would need to sit down, except that she was already sitting on a horse. They were formally courting through the summer of 1874, and Elk Hollow had opinions about this, as small communities always do. The opinions ranged from approving to skeptical to the particular brand of romantic enthusiasm that Mrs. Patterson expressed by producing excellent baked goods whenever Jasper came to supper, which was now twice a week when he came down from the mountain. There were two people whose opinions were less benign than the general community's. One of them was a man named Gerald Flint, who had been attempting to court Rose since her arrival in Elk Hollow, and who had taken her polite indifference for modesty rather than disinterest, and had now arrived at the interpretation that Jasper Thatcher was competition rather than accepted courtship. The other was a man named Dale Weston, who operated the mill at the south end of town and who had commercial dealings with Jasper for lumber from the mountain, and who seemed to resent, on general principle, anyone whose self-sufficiency exceeded his own. Gerald Flint was primarily a nuisance. He said things to Rose at the general store that were intended to be disparaging about mountain men as a class, and that she deflected with a calm pleasantness that she had developed specifically to handle people like him. He told her that Jasper Thatcher was not a settled man and would never be. She told him that settlements took many forms. Dale Weston was more troublesome, because he spread a version of a story through the town in August in which Jasper, some years before, had gotten into an altercation with a man over a disputed tree line on his property, an altercation that had become physical. The story as Weston told it made Jasper sound violent and uncontrolled. The story as it had actually happened, which Frank Hollis told Rose after she asked him directly, was that the man in question had come onto Jasper's property armed, and Jasper had removed the weapon from him and escorted him off the land without injuring him, which most people considered a model of restraint. When she told Jasper about the story Weston was circulating, he was quiet for a moment and then said, Weston was friends with the man whose tree line he was defending. That is the whole of it. It does not concern you that people might believe it, she asked. The people in this town who matter, he said, have known me for years. Their opinion is not changed by Dale Weston's version of an old story. He looked at her. Is yours? I asked Frank Hollis, she said, who told me the truth. Good, he said, and something in him settled. I will also tell you, she said, that I do not spend a great deal of time worrying about Dale Weston. His mouth curved. No, he said, I did not think you did. September brought the first cold and the aspens turning gold all across the mountain slopes, and Jasper took Rose up on a clear day to see the aspens from above, which was an experience she described in a letter to her old friend Sarah Whitman in Kansas as like watching a fire that gave no heat but only beauty. He told her the aspens were all connected underground, that a grove of aspens was not many trees but one organism, all of it sharing a root system that was older than anything visible above ground. That is remarkable, she said, that they look separate but are not. A lot of things are like that, he said, and he looked at her when he said it, and she looked back at him, and they were standing in the gold light of the aspen grove, and the wind moved the leaves and they sounded like gentle applause. He kissed her there in the aspen grove for the first time. He was careful about it, deliberate, the way he was about every physical thing, and it was brief and sure, and when he pulled back he looked at her face with an expression of such open and careful attention that she had to close her eyes for a moment because it was almost too much to hold. I should have asked first, he said. You have my retroactive permission, she said, and kissed him back. October brought a harder cold, and Jasper came down from the mountain less frequently, because his preparations for winter were substantial and serious matters of survival. He was candid about this with Rose, explaining the work that went into a mountain winter, the firewood and the preserved food and the animal care and the structural maintenance of the cabin, and she listened carefully and asked intelligent questions, because she was already thinking about that cabin as more than just a place he lived. On a Sunday in late October, sitting by the stove in Mrs. Patterson's parlor with Clara Dobbins reading in the corner in her strategically selective way, Jasper sat forward in his chair and looked at Rose with the organized expression she associated with him having arranged something important to say. I need to ask you something, he said. I have noticed you are building up to it, she said. You have been quiet all afternoon. I have been thinking all afternoon, he corrected. He leaned his forearms on his knees, his large hands loose and deliberate between them. I am not a man who says things he does not mean, so I need you to know that when I say this, I have thought about it from every angle and I am certain. I believe you, she said. I would like to marry you, Rose, he said. I understand that requires you to leave your position here and come up the mountain to a life that is significantly different from a schoolteacher's life in a settlement. I understand that is a great deal to ask. I am asking it because I cannot think of any other life than the one with you in it, and I thought I should tell you that clearly. Clara Dobbins turned a page of her book in the corner. Rose looked at Jasper Thatcher, at the careful honesty of his face, at the enormous hands held still and patient between his knees, at the man who had pulled her out of a flood and carried her through the water and had been, in some way she could not precisely articulate but was absolutely certain of, carrying her ever since. "Yes," she said. "Jasper, yes." He exhaled, and she realized that for all his calm he had been holding something. He reached out and took her hands, both of them in both of his, and just held them. "I will build you a proper room," he said almost immediately. "The cabin has the main room and the sleeping room. I will add a room that faces east so you get the morning light. You said you liked morning light." She had said that exactly once in passing in July. He had remembered it for 3 months. "You do not have to," she said. "I want to," he said. "I want the place to be good for you." She looked at their joined hands, his so much larger than hers, and thought that this was exactly right, this man, this balance between his strength and his attentiveness. "It will be good," she said. "Wherever you are is good, Jasper." The wedding was in November, in the little non-denominational meeting hall in Elk Hollow, because there was no church, being a mining settlement. Clara Dobbins organized it with characteristic efficiency and sentimentality and produced a wedding supper that involved 3 kinds of pie. Frank Hollies gave a toast that was brief and sincere. Mrs. Patterson cried in a productive way. Jasper stood at the front of the meeting hall in a clean dark coat, freshly shaved, his dark hair combed and still touching his collar, and when Rose came through the door in her mother's lace collar and her best dress, which was green and brought out the particular warm brown of her eyes, he looked at her with an expression that was entirely open, all the calm stripped away for just a moment, so that she could see everything underneath it. Everything underneath it was love. Large and steady, and patient as the mountains he lived on. The traveling preacher who had come through Elk Hollow on his circuit read the words and they said the things people said. And when he said Rose could kiss her husband, she reached up and pulled Jasper down by the front of his coat, because he was tall, and she kissed him properly. And the 20 people in the meeting hall applauded, and Clara Dobbins dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief she had clearly brought for that purpose. They went up the mountain on a clear, cold day in November, Rose and Jasper, with a mule loaded with her things and her mare on a lead. The high trail was quiet in the early winter, the aspens bare now, the pines dark and fragrant, the snow dusting the upper slopes. Jasper rode beside her and pointed things out, landmarks and animal signs, and the particular quality of the light on this north-facing slope versus that south-facing one, and she absorbed it all with the serious attention of someone beginning to learn a new language. The cabin was in a meadow near the tree line on the south slope of the ridge, sheltered from the north wind by a stand of old spruce and opening to the south toward a view of the valley far below that was, Rose thought when she first saw it, the view that God would have if God sat down in Colorado. The cabin was small but solid, built of squared logs with dovetail corners that had obviously been replaced and reinforced over the years, and there was a lean-to for the animals and a cold cellar dug into the hillside and a root cellar beside it, and everything was orderly and maintained with the precision she had come to expect. He had built the east room. He had been building it since October, coming down less frequently than he might have because of it, and she understood now why he had sometimes arrived in Elk Hollow with sawdust in his hair and a particular tiredness that was the good kind, the kind that came from satisfying work. The east room was small but perfectly built, with a window that faced the morning sun, and inside it he had made a desk from pine planks. "For your books," he said, standing in the doorway of the room looking at it, "and for writing, you write to your friend in Kansas. You will want a place for that." She turned and looked at him and could not speak for a moment. "Jasper Thatcher," she said finally, "you are remarkable." "The desk is rough," he said. "I can smooth it more in the spring." "The desk is perfect," she said. "Do not touch the desk." He almost smiled, and then he did smile, full and complete, and she went to him. Winter settled over the mountain like a patient hand, deep and white and absolute. Rose learned the rhythms of mountain life with the same focused intelligence she had brought to every other learning task in her life. She learned to read weather from the way the wind moved in the spruce trees and from the particular color of the sky at dusk. She learned how much wood a day required, which was more wood than she had imagined, and she learned to split it, which Jasper taught her one afternoon with a thoroughness that involved positioning her hands and her feet and the angle of her shoulders, and he stood behind her demonstrating the swing, and she suspected he was aware of how close he was standing, and she was certainly aware of it. She learned to cook on a wood stove with the consistency required by a man who worked physically hard all day, because Jasper burned through a remarkable number of calories, keeping the cabin operational and hunting and trapping through the mountain winter. She was an adequate cook who became, by February, a good one, and he ate everything she made with uncomplaining appreciation, which was the best kind of audience. She taught him things, too, in the long evenings by the fire. She read to him, which he had not expected to enjoy and found he did, because she read with a performer's sense of timing. She taught him chess, which became, by January, a war between equals that neither of them won consistently. She talked about history and literature and geography, and he engaged with it seriously, asking sharp questions, because Jasper Thatcher's mind was as capable as the rest of him, and had simply been spending its time on different subjects. He told her more about the war in fragments across many evenings, because that was how those things came out, and she understood that. She listened without trying to fix it or minimize it, because it was not fixable, and its effect on the shape of his life was real and permanent, and she respected the reality of it. After, he told her one night in January, with the wind working at the eaves and the fire warm and the snow deep outside, I could not go back to Ohio and be the person Ohio expected me to be. I did not know what person I was anymore. The mountain helped me find that out. What did you find out? She asked. That I was capable of more than Ohio suggested, he said. And that I needed quiet to hear myself. He looked at her in the firelight. I thought I would always need to be alone for that. I was wrong. It turns out I just needed the right person to be quiet with. She leaned her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The fire settled. They were deeply in love, thoroughly and completely, in the way that built slowly and then arrived all at once as a fullness that was indistinguishable from happiness. It was not a dramatic thing day to day. It was quiet, consistent, woven into everything. It was in the way he came into the east room in the morning with coffee, already made, before she had gotten to the stove. It was in the way she had worked out which of his silences were companionable, and which ones meant something was troubling him, and the particular way she approached him when it was the latter. It was in the physical ease between them, the fluency of two people who had become each other's home. Spring came late to the mountain, but it came. March and April were still deep snow, but May began the thaw, and the meadow around the cabin came alive the way mountain meadows came alive, suddenly and completely, as though they had been waiting with great enthusiasm and could finally let it go. Jasper took Rose to see the first columbine, which bloomed in a sheltered hollow near the creek, and she recognized it as the flower from the meadow below, from that first long afternoon the previous May. 1 year, she said. A good year, he said. The best year of my life, she said, and she meant it as a statement of fact, which was how she said it, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the aspen grove, with all that open, careful attention. It will not be the best year, he said. We have a great many years left. He was right about that in ways they were only beginning to understand. In June, Rose told him that she was expecting their first child, and she watched his face very carefully when she told him, because she could not predict which of his many kinds of stillness this news would produce. What it produced was something she had never quite seen before on his face, a kind of stunned joy, the particular expression of a man who had not known he wanted something and was discovering how much. He pulled her carefully into his arms as though she had become suddenly both more precious and more delicate, and she laughed into his chest and said, "I am not fragile, Jasper. "I know you are not," he said into her hair. "I am simply expressing myself." "This is your version of jumping up and down," she said. She felt him laugh, felt it in his chest before she heard it. "Yes," he said, "this is exactly that." He became, without making a production of it, more attentive through the summer in all the practical ways. He did not make her feel like an invalid, which she would not have tolerated, but he arranged things so that the harder physical work happened without her having to think about it. And he brought Clara Dobbins up from Elk Hollow in August to stay through the birth, which was in September. Clara came up the mountain trail with the cheerful competence of a woman who had attended 4 births in Elk Hollow and was not concerned, though she did organize the East Room into a confinement room with the thoroughness of a military officer, which Jasper observed with the respect of one military-trained person for another. "She is going to be fine," Clara told Jasper on the evening of August 31st, when Rose was showing all the signs of imminent labor, and Jasper was maintaining his calm with evident effort for the first time Rose could recall. "She is young and healthy, and she has good, strong bones. This baby is coming perfectly normally." "I know," Jasper said. "Then stop pacing," Clara said. He stopped pacing and sat down and achieved a stillness that was so complete it was its own kind of tension. But he stayed in the main room as Clara directed, and in the East Room with the morning window. Rose brought their son into the world on the 1st day of September, 1875, with Clara Dobbins' capable hands and a kind of clean, fierce determination that surprised no one who knew her. The baby was large and had lungs that announced themselves immediately and definitively. He had dark hair like his father, and, as these things emerged over the following weeks, Jasper's particular quality of attention, watching the world around him with serious amber-brown eyes that missed very little. Jasper held his son for the first time with the same hands that had pulled Rose from the flood, those enormous steady hands, and the contrast between the size of those hands and the size of what they held was so striking that Rose lay in the East Room bed watching it and could not speak for the fullness of it. "Henry," she said. She had told him she liked the name Henry. He had told her he liked the name Henry too. "Henry Thatcher," Jasper said, testing it quietly, looking at his son's face. "Hello, Henry." Henry regarded him with those serious eyes and then did what very young babies did, which was to locate Jasper's collar with one searching hand and grip it with the tenacity of someone who had found something essential and intended to keep it. "Good grip," Jasper said. "He is your son," Rose said. He looked up at her over the baby's head, and the expression on his face was so full and so tender, and so complete that she stored it somewhere in herself. She intended never to let go. Clara Dobbins stayed through September and into early October, which she called helping with the baby, and which was actually helping with all of it. The domestic management, the cooking during Rose's recovery, the practical maintenance of the household, and she did it with cheerful, unsentimental efficiency, and deflected every expression of gratitude with the brusqueness of someone who loved people, but was not going to make a large affair of it. When she left in October, she stood in the meadow with her horse saddled and her bags packed, and she looked at Rose and Jasper and Henry, who was in Jasper's arms examining a dried columbine flower with the intense concentration of a person who had recently discovered the concept of flowers. "Well," Clara said, "you have done all right for yourself, Rose Hale." "Rose Thatcher," Rose corrected. "Rose Thatcher," Clara agreed. "Yes, that fits." She looked at Jasper. "You take good care of my school teacher." "I intend to," he said. "She will also take care of you," Clara said. "That is how it works when you do it right." She rode down the trail, and Rose leaned against Jasper's side, and Henry dropped the columbine flower and watched it fall with the philosophical acceptance of someone who had not yet developed attachment to objects. The winter of 1875 into 1876 was the warmest in several years, which was a mercy with an infant, though Jasper was careful to point out that warm winters in the high country were not reliably warm, and that you prepared for the worst regardless. He had a book of weather records he had kept since arriving on the mountain, precise and consistent, with notes on snowfall and temperature, and the correlation to observations he had learned from Ute acquaintances in the region, and Rose found it fascinating reading. It was the mind behind the book that fascinated her, the discipline of consistent observation over years, the pleasure he took in understanding patterns. "Have you ever written these down for publication?" she asked. "A natural history of the San Juans." He looked surprised. "No, you should," she said. "This is remarkable data. Naturalists would want this." He was quiet about it for several days in the way that meant he was considering it seriously. And then he asked her to help him organize the records into something coherent. And that became one of the winter's projects, the two of them in the evenings at the pine desk in the East Room, Henry asleep in his cradle beside them, working through 8 years of mountain observation into a document that was, Rose told him honestly, genuinely good writing. Because his directness and precision made for clear and elegant prose. By the time Henry was pulling himself upright on the cabin furniture and investigating everything within reach with dedicated scientific curiosity, they had a manuscript of sorts, and Rose wrote to the Colorado Territorial Survey on her husband's behalf, and the resulting correspondence led, by the following summer, to a visit from a surveyor who spent 2 weeks on the mountain recording information, and who told Jasper his observations were remarkable and would be incorporated into the official survey records with his name attached. Jasper received this information with characteristic calm, and then, when the surveyor had gone, told Rose that it was her doing, and she told him it was his 8 years of work, and they compromised on the position that it was both, which was accurate. Henry was walking confidently by the summer of 1876 and was, by all evidence, going to be as physically capable as his father. He followed Jasper everywhere with the devoted attention of someone for whom the sun rose and set on a particular person, and Jasper was endlessly patient with him, explaining things, pointing out animal tracks, teaching him the names of trees and birds, holding him up to see things that were above toddler height. Rose watched the two of them in the meadow one afternoon, Jasper kneeling in the grass to show Henry something small and probably fascinating in the wildflowers, Henry's dark head bent close to his father's in perfect concentration, and she thought that this was the thing she had not known to want when she came to Colorado territory, this specific life, this specific mountain, these specific people. She went to them across the meadow, and Jasper looked up when she came and reached out his free hand and took hers, and Henry looked up too. And in the Columbine meadow in the afternoon of a Colorado summer, the Thatcher family was complete. They came down to Elk Hollow for the 4th of July celebration in 1876, which was the centennial year, and therefore an occasion of some civic ambition. And Clara Dobbins had organized a program of speeches and music and fireworks that Frank Hollies had sourced from Denver. Gerald Flint had moved on from Elk Hollow the previous year to try his luck in the silver mines at Silverton, and Dale Weston had experienced a significant reversal of his social standing when his version of the tree-line story had been publicly contradicted by 3 people who had witnessed the actual event. These things had resolved themselves, as unjust things sometimes did, through the patient action of time and truth. Rose stood in the main street of Elk Hollow in the July heat with Henry on her hip, because Henry had decided he was too large to be carried but had made exceptions for occasions of excitement. And Jasper stood beside her, and she watched him being gradually relaxed into the community the way a substance dissolved into water, slowly and then completely. He was not a social man by nature, but he was a man who showed up when it mattered, who could be relied upon, who fixed things and helped when asked. And Elk Hollow knew this and valued it. And after a year of being Rose Thatcher's husband, he was being treated simply as a man the town was glad to have around. Frank Hollies shook his hand and talked about lumber for a new building. Clara Dobbins appropriated Henry with his cheerful cooperation and carried him off to see the bunting. Mrs. Patterson appeared with pie. "They like you," Rose said to Jasper, watching the street. "They like you," he said. "I am an extension." "No," she said. "They respect you." She looked up at him. "You should let yourself be part of this place. You belong here as much as anywhere." He looked down at her with those amber eyes that she knew better than she knew her own reflection. "I belong where you are," he said. "If that is here, then here." "It is here," she said. "And the mountain, both." "Both," he agreed. The fireworks that evening were a genuine achievement for Elk Hollow. 6 shells fired over the creek meadow that burst in red and white and blue against the July dark. And Henry watched them from his father's shoulders with his hands gripping Jasper's hair, which Jasper bore without complaint. And Rose stood beside them and watched her son's face watching the sky. She thought about that day in April of 1874 when she had hung on a sandstone ledge above a flood and screamed into the noise, and a man with a rope and impossible calm had come along the shelf of rock above her and changed the trajectory of her life. She had never, in the 2 years since, stopped being grateful. Not for a single day. She had thought at first that the gratitude would normalize, would settle into something quieter, but it had not. It had simply changed shape. It was no longer the sharp, bright gratitude of survival, but the deep, wide gratitude of a life lived in full color, the gratitude of someone who knew, specifically and precisely, how differently things could have gone. Jasper must have felt something in her stillness because he looked down at her and she looked up at him and she said, "I am still grateful." He knew what she meant. He always knew what she meant. "For the flood," he said. "For you," she said. "For all of it." He looked at her for a long moment and the fireworks went off behind him, painting the sky, and his face in that light was the face of a man who was completely and irreversibly home. "Rose," he said. "So am I." Henry pointed at the sky and said something that was half word and half amazement, and the moment released itself happily into the ordinary and extraordinary evening, the celebration of 100 years of a country still finding out what it was, in a small town in Colorado Territory, with mountains all around. By 1877, Elk Hollow had grown. New miners had come with the continued silver news from the mountains to the north, and a proper doctor had arrived, a young man named Dr. Abel Pierce, who set up a practice in a building next to the general store and who was, to everyone's relief, competent and unpretentious. A second schoolteacher had come to assist with the growing number of children, which Clara Dobbins managed as head teacher with serene authority. A telegraph line was being discussed. Rose and Jasper came down from the mountain more regularly, particularly through the warmer months, and Rose took up an informal role helping Clara with the older students when she was in town, because she was a teacher and teaching was not something you stopped being. She also took it upon herself to establish a small lending library in the back of the general store, which Frank Hollies accommodated with only token resistance, and which became, within a season, genuinely popular. Jasper built the lending library's shelves. He drove them down from the mountain in his wagon and installed them in an afternoon, while people came in and out of the general store and watched him work. And he spoke to people with the measured directness he always used, and the measured directness worked on people the way it worked on everything, simply and effectively. When the shelves were up and the books arranged, Rose stood back and looked at them and then looked at Jasper, who was putting his tools back in their proper order. "You built a library," she said. "You made a library," he said. "I built shelves." "Do not minimize the shelves," she said. "The shelves are excellent." He turned and looked at her with the corner of his mouth curving in the way that still, after 3 years, arrived like something new. "Thank you," he said, "for the shelves." "You are welcome," she said. "For the shelves." They brought Henry home that evening on the trail up the mountain, Henry asleep across Jasper's saddle with his father's arm around him, the stars coming out over the San Juans in their summer abundance, and Rose rode beside them, and thought that she had been right to come west, right to take the mail coach and the teaching position and the gorge road that nearly killed her, because all of it had brought her here, to this trail, to this man, to this child, and to the particular shape of happiness that was only available to people who had arrived at exactly the right place. In the autumn of 1877, Rose told Jasper she was expecting again. Henry was 2 years old and had recently developed opinions about everything, and was expressing them with considerable vocabulary and volume. And the news of a sibling produced in him a long, thoughtful silence followed by a philosophical acceptance that reminded Rose almost painfully of his father. Jasper received the news this time with a joy that was quieter and equally deep, less of the stunned quality and more of the completeness, the sense of a man who understood now what this meant and felt the full weight of it as a gift. "Are you hoping for a girl?" Rose asked. "I am hoping for everyone to be healthy," he said, which was the truest answer. The second child arrived in the spring of 1878, in the same east room with the morning window, this time with Dr. Abel Pierce attending, because Clara Dobbins had declared that having a doctor in reach was a resource that should be used, and Rose had agreed. Dr. Pierce was efficient and calm, and got along with Jasper with the immediate mutual respect of two competent and practical people. Their daughter was born in April, when the columbines were just beginning in the sheltered hollow by the creek, and she had Rose's brown eyes and Jasper's dark hair, and a disposition from the first that was observant and quiet, and then occasionally very loud with great precision, as though she had thought it through, and decided that this particular moment required volume. They named her Frances, after Rose's mother. Henry was fascinated by Frances, with the complex engagement of a 2.5-year-old confronting a younger sibling, shifting between protective importance and philosophical bemusement at her existence. Jasper managed this with characteristic patience, explaining to Henry in careful terms that Frances was small and could not yet do the things Henry could do, and that it would be Henry's job to show her things as she grew, and Henry took this job with a seriousness that was deeply characteristic. Rose, nursing Frances in the east room one morning, with the April light coming through the window, and Jasper in the main room reading to Henry from a natural history book in his low, steady voice, thought that this cabin on the mountain, this small world they had made, was more than she had ever designed for herself when she had been in Kansas making plans. She had wanted something new, something still becoming itself. She had found something fully made and also continually making itself, which was better than her plan by a considerable margin. The years settled into each other with the generosity of good years. Henry grew into a boy who was at home in the mountains the way his father was at home in the mountains, knowing the trails and the seasons and the animals with an ease that came from years of patient teaching. He was, at 7, beginning to help Jasper with the lighter trapping work, checking snares in the lower meadows, and he came home from these expeditions with detailed reports that he delivered with the seriousness of a natural philosopher and the energy of a 7-year-old. Frances grew into a girl who had her mother's facility with language and her father's quality of observation, and who could spend an entire morning examining 1 square foot of meadow, and come in for dinner with an account of it that was both accurate and poetic. She also had, Rose discovered, a singing voice that was quite remarkable for its clarity, and this discovery led to a conversation between husband and wife about whether they should make arrangements for Frances to have musical instruction, which was available in Durango. "Durango is a full day's ride," Jasper said. "She has a voice," Rose said. He considered this with appropriate weight. "We could go in the spring when the trail is good," he said. "Stay for a week, see what is available. You would come." "Of course I would come," he said. "She is my daughter." They went to Durango in the spring of 1883, which was a significant adventure for the children, and a reminder for Rose that the world outside their mountain valley was considerably more populated and noisier than Henry and Frances were accustomed to. Frances received her musical assessment from a woman who taught piano and voice in a proper parlor, and who told Rose privately that the child had genuine talent and that regular lessons would be worthwhile. They arranged for monthly visits to a music teacher who had set up practice in Elk Hollow the previous year, a practical and economical solution that satisfied everyone. Henry, in Durango, discovered the public reading room, which had newspapers from Denver and St. Louis and New York, and he sat in it for 3 hours reading with the absolute concentration of someone who had grown up with books as precious objects and was now confronted with abundance. Jasper watched his son read with an expression Rose recognized as the one he wore when he was privately moved by something and maintaining composure, and she took his hand and he held hers, and they stood in the doorway of the reading room watching Henry read the world. "He is going to want more than the mountain," Rose said quietly. "Yes," Jasper said. "Is that all right with you?" He looked at her. "My son becoming someone who reads newspapers in a city and thinks about the wider world." He considered it properly, as he always did. "Yes, that is more than all right." A pause. "That is the point." She leaned her head on his shoulder. He was still as solid as the mountains themselves. "You would have made a good teacher," she said. "I had a good teacher," he said. They went home to the mountain, which was home the way places were home when they had been filled with years of living. The east room with the morning window had Rose's books on shelves Jasper had added over the years, and the natural history manuscript in its final form, with a letter from the Colorado Territorial Survey thanking Jasper for his contribution to the scientific record of the region, and Frances's drawings pinned to the walls, and a small framed photograph of the four of them that a traveling photographer had taken in Elk Hollow the previous summer, all of them squinting slightly in the sun. In that photograph, Jasper stood with his arm around Rose and his hand on Henry's shoulder, and his expression was the expression of a man who had everything he intended to keep. Rose stood with Frances at her side, and she was looking at the camera with the clean, direct gaze she had always had. That had been the first thing about her that had made him look again, all those years ago on a sandstone ledge above a flood. The photograph sat on the pine desk in the east room, and Rose passed it every day, and every day it told her something that was worth knowing. Elk Hollow continued to grow, and the wild first quality of the territory was shifting, as it always did, into something more established. Colorado had been a state since 1876, and the state of things brought new laws and new courts and new institutions, and the particular brand of frontier liberty that had made the West what it was becoming something different, not gone but reorganized. Rose watched it with the interest of a woman who had come specifically for the becoming and now was watching what things became. She taught, formally and informally, for all of it. She ran the lending library for 10 years and watched it grow to 300 volumes and become a point of genuine community pride. She organized the first formal school board election that included women's testimony, arguing before the 3 sitting board members with a clarity and force that Jasper observed from the back of the room with the expression of a man watching someone do something he is not surprised by but finds continuously impressive. He said afterward, riding home, "You should have been a lawyer." "I should have been many things," she said. "I chose to be a teacher and a mother and your wife." "Those were good choices," he said. "They were excellent choices," she said. "Your choice to come down from the mountain was also an excellent one." "I did not come down from the mountain," he said. "You came up from Kansas. And you came across a canyon wall with a rope," she said. He looked at her with those amber eyes that the years had weathered around but not dimmed. "That seems like the part of the story worth keeping," he said. "All of it is worth keeping," she said. Henry left for Denver at 17. Which was the age when leaving for Denver was considered reasonable for a young man with academic inclinations, and a letter of recommendation from his mother to a school administrator there. He went with the self-possession of someone who had been raised to be capable in the world, and he wrote letters home every week without prompting, detailed letters about the city and his studies and the people he was meeting, letters that his parents read at the kitchen table in the evening, and that gave them both a complex and proud species of missing him. He came home for summers, and each summer he came home a little different, more polished in some ways and unchanged in the essential ones. He still went out with his father on the first morning of every visit to check the mountain, walking the trails and reading the signs, and he came back from those mornings quieter and more himself than the city version. And Rose thought that Jasper had given him that, the anchor of a place known at depth. Frances, at 12, was performing in church socials and community gatherings with a voice that had grown to match her early promise. And Mrs. Alderton, her music teacher, wrote Rose a letter saying that Frances Thatcher was the most talented student she had taught in Colorado. Rose read this letter to Jasper, and he listened with his eyes closed and the expression that meant he was experiencing something fully, and then he opened his eyes and said, "She gets that from you." "She sings," Rose said. "I do not sing." "She gets the capacity for full commitment from you," he said. "The way she gives herself to it completely, that is yours." She looked at him across the table. "Jasper Thatcher," she said, "after all these years you still manage to say the exact right thing." "I have been practicing," he said. She laughed and he laughed, and Frances came in from the meadow with her hair loose and a columbine in her hand, and looked at her laughing parents with the fond exasperation of a 12-year-old, who has decided her parents are somewhat bewildering, and also that this is acceptable. The mountain had good years and hard years, as mountains did. There was a winter in 1885 that was severe enough to test every resource Jasper had built over many years of preparation, and they came through it intact but reduced, and Jasper spent the following summer rebuilding the stores with a thoroughness that was almost meditation. There was a spring flood in 1882 that took out the lower bridge near Elk Hollow and damaged 3 properties at the edge of town, and Jasper and a dozen other men spent 2 weeks helping with the reconstruction, Jasper directing the bridge repair with the authority of someone who knew structures and water with equal intimacy. Rose stood on the bank watching him work during the bridge repair, and she thought of the first flood, the one that had begun all of this, and she thought about the way life organized itself around certain events that remained load-bearing forever, events that everything else was built on top of. He was 41 in 1885, and the years in the mountain had kept him as they kept certain things, dense and strong and weathered into something more itself. His dark hair had silver at the temples now, which Rose found she had opinions about, specifically that she liked it. His face had deepened into its character, the strong jaw and the amber eyes and the quality of steadiness that had been the first thing she trusted about him. He was physically as capable as he had always been, because the mountain demanded it and he gave it what was demanded. She was 34, and the West had seasoned her in ways that the East had not anticipated producing. She was lean and sure-footed, and her hands knew things they had not known in Kansas, about wood stoves and mountain weather, and the particular quality of attention required by people who needed teaching. The brown of her eyes had stayed the same. Jasper had told her once that her eyes were one of the first specific things he had noticed about her, their directness, and she had told him that his stillness was the first thing she had noticed about him, the sense of a man who did not waste motion. They had both, it seemed, seen each other clearly very early. On a clear day in October of 1887, 13 years after the flood, Rose was sitting in the East Room at the pine desk writing a letter to Henry in Denver when Jasper came in and stood in the doorway, and she knew from the quality of his stillness that something particular was on his mind. "Tell me," she said, without turning from her letter. He came in and sat on the edge of the desk in the way he did when he had something to say that he wanted proximity for. She put down her pen and turned to face him. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the lower meadow," he said. "There is enough flat ground there for a proper house. I could build it over the spring and summer, stone and timber. More room than the cabin, a proper kitchen and a parlor and rooms for when Henry and Frances are home and for—" He stopped. She waited. "If you wanted more room," he said, "the cabin is what it is. It has been enough. But if you wanted more, I could build more." She looked at him for a moment, at this man who 8 years ago had been a solitary figure on a mountain with a pack and a canteen and a rope, who had spent 13 years building a life out here the same way he built everything, with care and precision and the willingness to do the work. "Is this about room?" she said. "Or is this about something else?" He looked at her directly. "It is about giving you everything you might want that I am capable of giving you," he said, "which is the same thing I have always wanted to do." She stood up from the desk and put her hands on his face, looking up at him, at the silver at his temples and the amber eyes and the jaw that was always going to be exactly like that, strong and steady and absolutely his. "Jasper," she said, "you have given me everything. A flood and a rope and a fire and a cabin and a family and a life that is better than anything I planned for myself. You built me a desk with morning light. You remembered what I said about morning light." She pressed her palms against his jaw. "Yes to the house. Yes to everything. I am grateful for every piece of it." He put his hands over hers, those enormous hands that had pulled her from the water and held their children and built their home and tended everything in it with unceasing care. "Rose," he said, the way he had said her name in the aspen grove with all that deliberateness, with the weight of a choice. "Jasper," she said, the way she always said it back. He pulled her gently forward and held her against his chest, which was as solid as it had always been, and she could hear his heartbeat, steady as the man himself, steady as the mountain around them. Outside the east window, the October light was doing what October light did in the high San Juans, turning everything amber in particular, touching the peaks with the last of the warm season, and the meadow was quiet. And down in Elk Hollow, the town was going about its business without them. And upstairs in her room, Frances was practicing scales in her clear, true voice. And far to the north, Henry was reading newspapers in Denver and becoming the person he was becoming. And the mountain stood around it all, patient and permanent, and Rose Hale Thatcher stood in her husband's arms in the east room with the morning window and was grateful, as she had always been and would always be, not just for the flood and the rope and the rescue, but for every single ordinary, extraordinary day that had come after it, the days that were the real gift, the ones that could only be given by a life lived with the right person, in the right place, without regret. The house in the lower meadow rose over the following year, stone and timber as he had said, with a kitchen that had proper proportions and a parlor with windows on 2 walls and 3 bedrooms, and a room that faced east with morning light. Because, of course, there was a room that faced east with morning light. And Rose brought her books from the cabin and arranged them on new shelves and put the photograph of the 4 of them on the pine desk that made the journey down from the cabin along with everything else that mattered. Because the pine desk was irreplaceable and Jasper knew this and had built a special brace for it on the wagon. Henry came home that Christmas from Denver and walked through the new house with the expression of someone recalculating a set of coordinates, and then he found his parents in the kitchen and said, with the directness he had entirely from Jasper, "It is wonderful. You built exactly what she would want." "I know what she wants," Jasper said. Henry looked at his father across the kitchen with the look of a young man who was learning, in the years away from home, that the things his father knew were not common knowledge among men, and were therefore more significant than he had understood while growing up surrounded by them. "Yes," he said, "you do." Frances came home in the summer and filled the house with music, which it had been built with sufficient size to properly contain, and the evenings on the porch of the lower meadow house in the Colorado summer were something that all 4 of them would carry for the rest of their lives. The mountains above them and the valley below, the smell of the pines and the sound of Frances's voice carrying across the meadow in the long golden light, and Jasper and Rose in adjacent chairs on the porch, his hand over hers on the armrest between them, watching their children and their mountain in the deep, uncomplicated happiness of people who know exactly how fortunate they are. Henry married a young woman named Catherine in Denver in 1891, a schoolteacher, which made Rose press her lips together against a smile when Henry announced it. And the wedding was in Denver, and all four Thatchers made the journey by train. The first time Rose and Jasper had been on a train together, and Jasper sat by the window and watched Colorado passing at train speed, with the expression of a man making careful notes about this new experience and reserving judgment. Catherine was intelligent and warm and treated Henry with a directness that reminded Rose of her own relationship with Jasper, and made her certain, within the first afternoon, that this was exactly right. Catherine and Rose liked each other immediately and completely, in the way of women who recognize in each other a fundamental similar way of being in the world. At the wedding reception, Henry danced with his mother and said into her hair, "Thank you for moving west." "Thank you for the flood," she said. He pulled back and looked at her. "What?" "Your father pulled me out of a flood when we were strangers," she said. "Everything came from that." He looked across the room at his father, who was standing with Catherine's father talking about something with the focused attention Jasper gave to everything, and then he looked back at his mother. "He never told me that story," Henry said. "He would not have," Rose said. "Ask him sometime, he will tell you if you ask." Henry asked him, and Jasper told him, and the conversation happened on the porch of the house in Denver the evening after the wedding, and Rose watched it from inside through the window, father and son in chairs on the porch the way Rose and Jasper had sat on so many porches, and she watched Jasper's hands as he told it, the particular gesture he made when he described dropping the rope down. A motion she had never seen him make before, but that she recognized immediately as the muscle memory of someone who had done something once that they did not forget. Henry was quiet for a long time after Jasper finished, and then he said something that Rose could not hear through the window, and Jasper put his hand on his son's shoulder and kept it there, and that was its own complete sentence. Frances, in the end, chose music over the mountain and the settled life it suggested, and she went to study in St. Louis at 20 and then to Chicago, and sang in concert halls, and sent home programs that Jasper kept in a wooden box on the shelf with his weather records and his survey letters. She came home every 2 years, and the house rang with her for the duration, and she brought them news of the world they did not live in and took back from them, something she said she could not describe but needed, something about the mountain and the clean air and her parents on the porch. "You two are the thing I use as the measuring stick," Frances told Rose once, sitting together in the east-facing room of the lower house. "When I am trying to figure out what something should be, whether something is right, I think about you and Papa." Rose was 53 and she had lines around her eyes and the brown had gone partly silver, and she was, she thought, precisely the woman the mountain had made her, which was a different woman from the one Kansas had made, and a better one, more real, more in possession of herself. "You are making us sound like a standard of measure," she said. "You are," Frances said simply. "Is that not what good parents are?" Rose thought about Jasper, who at that moment was outside checking on the horses with the same attention he had given to horses for 30 years, still capable, still tireless, still the steadiest thing in any landscape he occupied. She thought about the flood and the rope and the ledge and the carrying, and about all the days after it, the thousands of ordinary days that had accumulated into this life, this daughter, this room, this mountain. "Yes," she said, "I suppose that is what good parents are." In the late summer of 1900, 26 years after the flood, Rose and Jasper sat on the porch of the lower meadow house in the evening and watched the alpenglow come on the peaks above, which it did every clear evening like a performance that never got old. Henry and Catherine had a son now, named Thomas, who was 5 years old and already showed signs of being interested in everything in the way of children who are going to be engaged with the world. Frances was in Chicago doing something musically important that she had explained in a letter that Rose had read to Jasper 3 times. The evening was warm and the mountain was doing all the things the mountain did in late summer, which were considerable and beautiful, and Jasper had his boots off on the porch rail in a posture of comfort that he permitted himself with a relaxation that had taken years to achieve in full. Rose looked at him. He looked at her. "Still grateful?" he asked. He asked it sometimes. He had been asking it one way or another since the first night. "More every day," she said. "You." He turned his amber eyes to the mountains above them, their mountains, and then back to her, and his face in the evening light was the face of a man who had found what he had not known he was looking for and had kept it with both hands for more than a quarter century. "More every day," he said. "Rose, more every day." She reached across and took his hand. He folded his over hers with the same sure steadiness he had used since the beginning, since the ledge above the flood, since all the carrying, all the years. The peaks above caught the last of the light and held it, amber and rose and gold, and the meadow below them was full of columbines in the last of the season. And the mountain stood around them as it had always stood, permanent and patient, and full of everything they knew. And the evening settled into night in the San Juans of Colorado, with two people on a porch who had built a life out of a flood and a rope, and the simple, irrevocable decision to keep moving toward each other, year after year, until there was no distance left at all.